The soft hum of the engines echoed through the first-class cabin, where well-dressed business executives and high-profile travelers lounged in plush leather seats, sipping on champagne and scrolling through their expensive devices. The atmosphere was one of quiet luxury, until a small burst of excitement disturbed the stillness. Elijah, a bright-eyed black boy, no older than 10, sat by the window, his tiny hands pressed against the glass as he marveled at the endless clouds. This was his first time flying first class, and the thrill of it shimmered in his innocent smile. His designer clothes, handpicked by his father, made him look like he belonged among the wealthy travelers, but to some, he didn't. From across the aisle, Olivia Carter, a middle-aged white flight attendant, took notice. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she scanned Elijah from head to toe, her lips pursing in disapproval. Something about him, about a black child sitting alone in first class, seemed out of place to her. She didn't like it. She plastered on a thin, forced smile and began making her way toward him, already deciding that he didn't belong. But what Olivia didn't know was that Elijah's father was no ordinary man, and before this flight was over, she would regret everything. Elijah sat in his first-class seat, wide-eyed with excitement as he looked out the window. The world below seemed so small, a vast stretch of clouds drifting under the golden sun. He had never flown first class before, and his father had promised it would be an experience to remember. A shadow fell over him. The scent of strong perfume and faint coffee reached his nose as Olivia Carter, the flight attendant, stopped beside him. Her hands rested on her hips, fingers tapping impatiently. She wasn't just looking at him. She was studying him, her gaze shifting between him and the well-dressed white passengers around him. Her forced smile was tight, lips barely curling. "Sweetheart? Are you lost?" Her voice was overly sweet, condescending. "Coach is in the back." Elijah blinked in confusion. He glanced around as if trying to understand what she meant. His father had told him exactly where to sit. "No, ma'am," he said politely. "My dad booked this seat for me." The fake warmth in Olivia's expression faded. Her brows knitted together slightly, and the thin line of her mouth tightened. Her demeanor shifted from polite to authoritative in an instant. "I need to see your ticket," she said, her tone sharper than before. Passengers nearby turned their heads, some lifting their glasses of champagne, pretending not to eavesdrop. Others exchanged side glances, sensing something uncomfortable in the air. Elijah hesitated, his small fingers reaching into his pocket to retrieve the neatly folded boarding pass. His heart thudded, unsure why she was treating him differently. He had done nothing wrong. Olivia snatched the ticket from his grasp. She scanned it quickly, her eyes flicking over the details. Her lips pursed, tightening even further. Instead of handing it back or offering an apology, her expression changed again. This time, a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. She reached forward, gripping Elijah's arm. The grip on Elijah's wrist was firm, not painful, but commanding. His breath hitched as Olivia yanked him to his feet. Passengers looked up now, their curiosity fully piqued. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply watched, choosing silence over intervention. "Come on, let's take you where you belong," Olivia said, her voice loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. Elijah felt his cheeks burn. Humiliation flooded through him as eyes bore into him from every direction. "But my dad said—" Olivia didn't let him finish. She dragged him toward the aisle, her grip still firm. His sneakers scuffed against the carpet as he struggled to keep up with her pace. The first-class passengers fell into two categories: those who looked away, pretending nothing was happening, and those who watched with quiet discomfort, but did nothing. A middle-aged businessman in a tailored suit shifted uneasily, adjusting his tie. His lips parted slightly, as if he was about to say something, but then he hesitated. Instead, he lowered his gaze and busied himself with his drink. Elijah swallowed down the lump in his throat. His father had always told him to be respectful, to never cause a scene. But this wasn't fair. He hadn't done anything wrong. His hands balled into fists at his sides as Olivia pulled him farther from his seat, weaving through the rows toward economy class. Passengers in economy turned their heads, surprised to see a first-class flight attendant leading a well-dressed young boy into their section. Then, just as Olivia reached for an empty seat to place him in, another flight attendant rushed toward them, her face tense with urgency. "Ma'am, we have a problem." Olivia turned sharply, visibly annoyed at being interrupted. She still had one hand on Elijah's wrist, as if afraid to let him go. "What is it?" she snapped. The second flight attendant hesitated for just a second before speaking. "The captain says we need to reopen the cabin doors." The announcement sent an immediate ripple through the passengers. Several of them turned in their seats, murmuring among themselves. Flight attendants rarely reopened the doors after passengers were seated. And then, it happened. The soft whoosh of the cabin doors unlocking filled the air, and the atmosphere in first class changed instantly. The once relaxed tension turned into something heavier. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was apprehension. A powerful presence entered the cabin. A tall black man in a sharply tailored navy blue suit stepped inside. He moved with the kind of confidence that made people notice without him needing to say a word. His broad shoulders squared, his stride measured, precise. Passengers who had barely glanced up earlier now sat straighter in their seats. A hushed silence stretched through the cabin. Elijah's heart pounded. He knew that posture, that expression. He had seen it before, but never directed at someone like this. Jonathan King had arrived. His father. His presence was an unspoken force. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto Olivia. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The way he carried himself, the way the air shifted around him, was enough to send a cold wave through the flight crew. Olivia instinctively took a step back. Her grip on Elijah's wrist loosened completely. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Then Jonathan finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but each word carried the weight of a command. "Where is my son?" Silence. Elijah saw the way Olivia's face paled slightly, the way her confidence cracked just for a moment. His father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. And Olivia Carter, who had humiliated a child moments ago, was about to realize she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Jonathan's polished dress shoes moved silently across the plush first-class carpet, but the force of his presence made the entire cabin hold its breath. His piercing gaze locked onto Olivia as he closed the distance between them. The tension was suffocating. The captain and head flight attendant rushed forward, their eyes darting nervously between Jonathan and Olivia. They had seen corporate executives fly first class before, but this was different. This was Jonathan King, a name that sent ripples through boardrooms and business empires. Olivia took an instinctive step back. "Sir, I thought he was alone," she stammered, her voice thin, her earlier arrogance evaporating like mist. Jonathan didn't blink. His expression didn't waver. His deep, controlled voice cut through the air like a blade. "You didn't think," he said, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "You assumed." Passengers watched in stunned silence. The businessman who had ignored Elijah's mistreatment earlier now sat up straighter, adjusting his tie nervously. A woman in pearl earrings shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in the conversation. Jonathan's presence was suffocating, not because he was loud, but because he didn't need to be. Every word, every movement was calculated, designed to make his opponent crumble. The captain swallowed, his fingers twitching at his sides. "Mr. King, I assure you, we had no idea." Jonathan raised a hand, silencing him without effort. His gaze never left Olivia. The flight attendant's chest rose and fell rapidly, her earlier smirk completely wiped from existence. The confidence, the authority she had exuded over Elijah, was now nowhere to be found. Jonathan finally spoke again. "My son was humiliated, degraded, and physically removed from a seat I paid for. You didn't ask questions, you didn't verify. You saw a black boy in first class, and you assumed he didn't belong." His voice remained quiet, but the entire plane heard every single word. And Olivia Carter? She was trapped in her worst nightmare. Jonathan's fingers moved with precision, flipping open his phone with practiced ease. The moment it was at his ear, the entire cabin knew. This was a man who was used to making things happen with a single call. "Get me Daniel Green." The name alone sent a wave of whispers through first class. Passengers exchanged glances. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Daniel Green. That was Daniel Green, one of the most powerful civil rights attorneys in the country. Within seconds, the call connected. "Jonathan!" came a voice on the other end. Smooth, confident, and very familiar. "What's the problem?" Jonathan's lips curled into something cold. He never took his eyes off Olivia. "The airline just violated a civil rights policy," he said. "I need an immediate legal response." Silence. Then Green's voice came through, measured but lethal. "I'm on it." Olivia's face drained of color. Jonathan turned to the captain, his voice still composed, still terrifying. "This flight attendant assaulted my son under false pretenses," he said smoothly. "Your airline is now facing a civil lawsuit. And, for your information," he exhaled, as if dropping just another casual detail, "I own 20% of this airline's shares." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers stared at Olivia, realization dawning in their eyes. They knew his name. Jonathan King wasn't just wealthy. He was a corporate giant, a powerhouse, the kind of man who could change people's careers with a phone call. And Olivia Carter? She had just destroyed hers. The whispers in the cabin grew. The businessman who had ignored Elijah earlier now leaned forward, adjusting his tie nervously. Even the pilot shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing this was way above his pay grade. Olivia tried to speak. I was just following protocol." Jonathan cut her off with a slight tilt of his head. "You were following your bias." He turned back to his phone, tapping the screen. "And now, I'm going to make sure that bias costs you everything." Olivia shook now. She could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze, feel the judgment, the disapproval, the slow realization that she was no longer in control. And then, the voice of true power spoke from Jonathan's phone. "I'm contacting the airline's board right now," Green said smoothly. "And Jonathan, I assume you want me to start the formal lawsuit paperwork?" Jonathan's expression never changed. "Do it." And Olivia? She couldn't even breathe. Jonathan King never believed in shouting. He never needed to. When he spoke, things moved. The phone in his hand rang again. This time he wasn't calling an attorney. He was calling someone bigger. The moment the line connected, Jonathan's voice didn't change. He didn't soften it. He didn't negotiate. "I need you to handle a situation," he said. On the other end of the line, a voice just as powerful responded. "Consider it done." Passengers held their breath. Olivia froze. Then, the unthinkable happened. The cabin intercom crackled to life. The head flight attendant stepped forward, gripping the microphone. Her voice was firm. "Attention passengers," she announced. "Due to an internal investigation, Flight Attendant Olivia Carter has been relieved of duty, effective immediately." Silence. Then, a wave of gasps. Olivia stood there, paralyzed. Her face had gone completely white. Passengers turned fully in their seats now, their eyes flicking between Olivia and Jonathan. Olivia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Jonathan King finally looked away from her, his attention turning back to his son. "Elijah," he said, voice calm again, like nothing had happened. "Come here." Elijah, stunned, hurried to his father's side. Jonathan straightened his son's blazer, dusted off his sleeves, and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Go back to your seat," he said softly. "You belong there." And Elijah? For the first time since stepping onto that plane, he believed it. Meanwhile, Olivia stood frozen as two other flight attendants approached her, murmuring instructions. She was no longer in charge. She was no longer respected. She had been publicly stripped of her position, humiliated in the same way she had humiliated Elijah. Passengers didn't look away this time. Some nodded in approval. Others whispered. And Olivia Carter? She realized, with chilling certainty, that her career was over. Jonathan King had done exactly what he said he would, and he never even had to raise his voice. The atmosphere inside the cabin was thick with tension, the weight of Olivia's downfall settling over every passenger. It was as if the air itself had shifted, as if the very plane had stopped moving, frozen in the shock of what had just happened. Olivia Carter had spent years walking these aisles with authority, deciding who deserved respect and who didn't. And now, she was the one being dismissed. Her hands trembled as she reached for her things, her mind spinning. The whispers from passengers grew louder, like a storm closing in. She could feel all their eyes on her, watching, judging. Some passengers had smirks on their faces. Others shook their heads in disgust. For years, she had carried herself with superiority, treating people like they were beneath her. Now, she was the one at the bottom. The head flight attendant, stiff with professionalism, gestured toward the aisle. "Ms. Carter, please exit the aircraft immediately." The words cut like a knife. A slow, deep breath filled Olivia's lungs as she tried to hold herself together. But she couldn't. Everything was falling apart. She lifted her gaze, her eyes locking with Jonathan King's. He hadn't moved an inch. He didn't need to. His presence alone had done the job. And just when she thought he was done, he spoke again. His voice so low, so lethal, that the entire first-class cabin held its breath. "Next time, think before you act." A pause. Then, with a smirk, he added, Oh wait. He tilted his head slightly. You won't have a next time. Passengers murmured, some chuckling under their breath. It was over. Olivia had nothing left to say. With one final glance at the plane that had once been her domain, she turned on shaky legs and began the longest, most humiliating walk of her life. As she reached the front of the plane, she heard it. A slow, mocking applause. At first, it was one person, then another, then another. The entire first-class cabin erupted into applause, clapping as Olivia vanished from their sight. She didn't turn around. She didn't dare. For years, she had been untouchable. Now, she was nothing. And as the plane doors sealed shut behind her, Olivia Carter finally understood. She hadn't just lost her job. She had lost everything. The applause gradually faded, but the energy in the cabin remained electrified. It was as if justice had just been served in real time, leaving an aftershock that no one could ignore. Jonathan King didn't react. He didn't need to. His job was done. Elijah, still clutching his seatbelt, stared up at his father with wide, fascinated eyes. This was the first time he had seen power like this. The kind of power that didn't need yelling. The kind that commanded respect without force. Jonathan glanced at his son, his eyes softening just slightly. There was no need for a lecture. No need to say, "This is how you handle people like that." Elijah had just lived it. Passengers who had once ignored the young boy now acknowledged him. A businessman across the aisle, dressed in a sleek gray suit, raised his glass toward Jonathan in a silent gesture of respect. A woman in her 50s, who had watched everything unfold with shock, now looked at Elijah with something different in her eyes. Not condescension, not judgment, but understanding. Everything had changed. Not because Elijah had changed, but because their perception of him had. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for takeoff. Thank you for your patience." The engines rumbled as the plane began its ascent, the soft glow of the cabin lights flickering slightly. Elijah turned back to the window, watching as the world below grew smaller and smaller. This time, he didn't feel small. This time, he didn't feel like he had to prove he belonged, because now, he knew he did. He turned to his father, a small, grateful smile on his face. "Dad, thank you." Jonathan, still calm and composed, simply placed a strong hand on his son's shoulder. "Never let anyone tell you where you belong." Elijah nodded, absorbing every word, and for the first time in his life, he truly believed it. As the plane soared through the night sky, Jonathan closed his eyes, leaning back in his seat. Elijah, now feeling at peace, did the same. The world had tried to tell him he didn't belong, and tonight, his father had proved them all wrong. Elijah would never forget this moment, not because of what happened to Olivia, but because of what he had learned about himself. He would never let anyone make him feel small again. And as the plane disappeared into the clouds, so did every doubt he had ever carried. He wasn't just Jonathan King's son. He was someone who belonged. Anywhere. Always. The terminal was alive with noise, but all eyes were fixed on Jonathan King and his son Elijah as they stepped off the plane. A wall of reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing, microphones raised. The story had gone viral before they even landed. Passengers streamed past them, whispering as they recognized the man who had just dismantled an entire airline's reputation in a matter of minutes. Some offered nods of respect. Others simply watched, eager to witness what would happen next. Elijah tightened his grip on his father's hand. He had never been the center of attention before. Not like this. His heart pounded, but when he looked up at Jonathan, he saw calm, unshaken power. His father had walked through far bigger storms than this one. A reporter boldly stepped forward, microphone extended. "Mr. King, is it true that your son was removed from first class simply because of the color of his skin?" Jonathan didn't stop walking. He didn't even acknowledge the question. But Elijah did. For the first time in his life, he didn't hesitate. He slowed, turning to face the cameras. Reporters leaned in, sensing something big. "She thought she was powerful," Elijah said, his voice clear, strong. "But she just learned. True power belongs to those who earn it." Silence. Then, chaos. Cameras exploded with flashes. Reporters shouted over one another, scrambling to capture the moment a 10-year-old boy stood up and delivered a statement that would be heard around the world. Jonathan smiled, a rare, proud smile, before placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. It was time to go. They walked forward, leaving the frenzy behind. But the impact of Elijah's words would not be left behind. Somewhere, on a tiny screen in a cramped apartment, Olivia Carter was watching the news, her face pale. Somewhere, inside the boardroom of an international airline, executives were panicking, drafting statements, making desperate calls, knowing that one of the most powerful men in the world was now their greatest enemy. And somewhere, a young black child watching this story unfold on TV was realizing, for the first time, that he belonged anywhere he chose to be. Because this wasn't just about one flight. This was about changing the rules forever.